Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're watching a special edition of The Listening Post. When trying to explain conflicts, historians and journalists examine the ideologies that helped create them. But in the media coverage of Israel and Palestine, one ideology deserves far more attention than it's been getting. Zionism was the brainchild of Jewish intellectuals in 19th century Europe. It was a response to the tidal wave of anti-Semitism sweeping the continent at that time. Their solution, a Jewish state, but on land already inhabited by Palestinians. It was a reflection of Europe's colonial thinking. However, after decades of dispossession, war, and apartheid, critics of Zionism call it indefensible, if not racist. In Western media, those critiques are seldom heard. Instead, we get the opposite, a debate about whether opposition to that ideology, anti-Zionism, is anti-Semitic. Later on in this program, we will hear from a Jewish American community leader about her transition from a true believer in Zionism to a committed opponent of it. But first, the Listening Post's Daniel Turi on Zionism, the discourse that surrounds it, and what it tells us about the world's longest-running occupation.
Across the Western world, from parliaments to TV studios, opinion makers have been pushing an alarming message.
Let's call it out for what it is. Anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism.
They say that a political critique of Israel, anti-Zionism, is in fact a form of anti-Semitism.
On avait dit clairement que l'anti-sionisme, c'est-à-dire le fait de nier l'existence même de l'État d'Israël, le droit d'Israël à exister, était une forme renouvelée d'antisémitisme.
But what almost never gets discussed is Zionism itself.
There is no argument anymore that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. That is as plain as day.
News audiences seem puzzled. A poll last year found that most Americans either don't know what Zionism is or don't know what to think of it.
Zionism is the idea of Jewish nationalism, and its ultimate goal was a Jewish state in Palestine. This goal was achieved in 1948 with the establishment of the State of Israel. Zionism is now the official ideology of the State of Israel.
Zionism is central to understanding what's happening in Palestine and Israel at this moment. Zionism is the motive force of the confiscation of land in Palestine, and it is at the very core of the ethnic cleansing and genocide we are witnessing today.
Like most ideologies, Zionism emerged as a response to a problem. In the late 19th century, anti-Semitism in Europe had reached historic levels. Thousands of Jews were killed in a succession of pogroms, with many more driven from their homes. Among the Jewish intellectuals proposing solutions was Theodor Herzl, a journalist in Austria-Hungary. Herzl called for the creation of a Jewish state outside of Europe, soon choosing Palestine as the promised land. He knew this would entail the displacement of Palestinians. But as Herzl himself noted, Zionism was a colonial idea.
The colonial mindset was absolutely crucial to Zionist ideology. All the founding fathers of Zionism were Europeans, and Theodor Herzl thought of the Jewish state in Palestine as an extension of Europe. He spoke about the Jewish state as manning the ramparts of Western civilization against Eastern barbarism.
At this point, colonialism is not a bad word. The United States and Europe are really subjugating non-European peoples throughout the global South. And it's at this moment that Zionism is really born. This is one of the tragedies of Zionism, in that Zionism was really a response to racial understandings of the hierarchies of humanity. At the same time that Zionism sought an escape from those hierarchies, unfortunately, it would recreate them in Palestine.
The Jews saw themselves as running away from a Europe that was not working for them, and making in Palestine something that could be of their own, but this worked out for the Palestinian peasantry as being something like displacement. The Zionists then thought, well, yeah, but you have this immense Arab world. So if you have to move a few miles, is that so bad? I mean, this is the way they thought. They were operating in a world of complicated justice.
Before World War II, most Jews did not support the Zionist cause. Many opposed it, and in Palestine, Jewish settlers were a minority. Some advocated peaceful coexistence with the Palestinians, but most Zionist leaders favored a more militant approach, among them Ze'ev Jabotinsky, the father of a new kind of Zionism on the right. In 1925, Jabotinsky wrote, "Zionism is a colonizing adventure, and therefore it stands or falls on the question of armed forces." Zionist militias were established and soon played a decisive role. In the wake of the Nazi Holocaust, Jewish refugees arrived in Palestine, and the United Nations approved the creation of Jewish and Arab states.
Latest pictures from war-torn Palestine provide these impressions of Haganah forces consolidating areas under their control.
During the fighting that followed, the militias carried out the Nakba, the catastrophe, expelling roughly 750,000 Palestinians from their homes to make way for Israel.
So we Palestinians have been talking about our condition as an ongoing Nakba, as an ongoing catastrophe. My parents were both children in 1948, and both their families became refugees. They lost everything. And so that is the crux of the Palestinian condition, that Zionism is premised on the very erasure of Palestinian political rights. What it has meant on the ground since 1948 until this moment has been dispossession, separation, condition of relentless exile.
The guiding principle of the State of Israel has been about building as large as possible Jewish state in Palestine with as few Arabs inside its borders as possible. In 1948, Israel perpetrated the Nakba. 750,000 Palestinians became refugees. In 1967, after the Six-Day War, Israel trebled its territory, and there was 250,000 refugees from the West Bank who were not allowed to return. So this is the logic of settler colonialism, ethnic cleansing. In my opinion, Zionism is a racist ideology because it privileges one ethnic group over the other.
I don't think of Zionism as racism. I think of Zionism as being a movement which is very internally focused. It was trying to create something novel. And because in order to create something novel, it had to self-segregate. Other people outside of the rubric, the precincts of Zionism, may have felt excluded and may interpret that as racism.
יהי זכרו של זאב ז'בוטינסקי, איש הספרא והסייפא, ומאור ציוני ענק, ברוך לעולמי עד.
Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu sees himself as the heir of the right-wing Zionism championed by Ze'ev Jabotinsky a century ago. Netanyahu's father was Jabotinsky's secretary. But the strands of Zionism that drive Netanyahu and the religious hardliners in his coalition are even more extreme.
מדינת ישראל חייבת לשלוט ביטחונית על כל השטח מערבית לירדן.
His government has ramped up the building of illegal settlements in the occupied West Bank. The devastation of Gaza in response to Hamas's attacks on October the 7th has put Israel on trial for genocide at the world's highest court, and they plan to take it even further.
In the war, Israel's aim was to render Gaza uninhabitable, and the level of devastation is unprecedented. There is an Israeli ministry's plan for depopulating the whole of Gaza. There was a meeting in Jerusalem for the resettlement of Gaza. 12 ministers attended this meeting.
אנחנו מיישבים את ארצנו לאורכה ולרוחבה, שולטים בה
And this is the climax of something that was inherent in Zionism from the beginning.
Over in the US, Israel's biggest ally, support for Zionism spans the political spectrum, starting in the White House.
35 years ago I said, you don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist, and I'm a Zionist. You don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist.
But with opposition to Zionism growing, including among American Jews, pro-Israel lobby groups have set out to delegitimize anti-Zionism in politics and the media.
But anti-Zionism, I've long said, is anti-Semitism. I was wrong. Anti-Zionism is genocide.
In December, the US House of Representatives gave that narrative its official seal of approval, passing a resolution that explicitly equates anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. It's a conflation that continues to echo through the halls of power and newsrooms of Western capitals, confusing audiences and stifling dissent against Israel's war.
Hatred of Jews had to find a new vehicle. And in the main, that became anti-Zionism.
If what you mean by anti-Zionism is that Israel never should have been invented in the first place, I think that's historically lazy. And I think it's a mistake. I think Israel should have been created. I think the Zionist movement should have happened. But do I think you're being anti-Semitic? I don't really see the connection.
Anti-Semitism is the hatred of Jews because they are Jews. Anti-Zionism is not about Jews, it's about Israel and its policies. And this is a very dangerous trend because the criticisms of Israel's behavior in Gaza are perfectly legitimate.
In relation to Zionism, the media is its first moral and ethical and professional responsibility is to not ally Zionism with Judaism. The elision of anti-Semitism with opposition to Zionism is cynical and it is harmful for the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip who are experiencing the warp speed, fast death that the Israeli state, armed by the US arsenal, is wreaking on them. That elision has been the armor through which Israel can continue to conduct this genocide.
The conflation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism is provoking pushback from a growing number of young Jewish Americans. Anti-Zionist Jews have formed a major part of the anti-war protests that have taken place across the U.S., and they are not taking kindly to being accused of racism towards their own community. Given the importance of U.S. support for Israel, it is a movement that could prove pivotal. Simone Zimmerman is one of the leaders of that movement, the co-founder of If Not Now, an advocacy group that aims to sway American Jews against the occupation. She also campaigns against anti-Semitism and its weaponization by the pro-Israel lobby. But she wasn't always on that side of the argument. Simone Zimmerman was raised a committed Zionist. Her transition away from that way of thinking forms the core of an award-winning documentary called Israelism that was released last year.
I wanted to know answers from within my own community, and nobody could answer those questions for me. How is it that I am like the best the Jewish community has to offer? I've been through all the trainings, all the programs, and I don't know what the occupation is. I don't know what the settlements are.
Simone Zimmerman joins us now from New York City. Simone, thank you for speaking with us here today at the Listening Post. In that documentary, Israelism, a core theme was your personal turn away from Zionism. To start with, talk about your former self, the pro-Israel activist. What did you believe at the time, and how did you come to disbelieve it?
Well, I grew up with a narrative about Israel that was incredibly romantic and frankly simplistic. I grew up with an idea of my commitment to Israel as inseparable from my Judaism. I grew up spending a lot of time in Israel, and I planned to go be an Israel advocate on my college campus. We often said that that was the other battlefield. You know, the college campus is the battlefield for Israel's legitimacy. And so I wanted to go help tell the truth about Israel. Now that all got quite complicated for me when I began actually meeting students on my campus who had different life experiences related to Israel in different ways. I began reading texts by both Palestinian and Israeli historians who complicated the story of 1948. I learned about the Nakba, the mass displacement of Palestinians in 1948 that led to the founding of the state. And very quickly, that narrative was complicated and shattered for me.
And you're not the only one, because there's been a broader shift amongst young Jewish Americans towards opposition to, or at least ambivalence about Zionism. And we've heard those pro-Israel lobbyists say, you know, we've lost the kids. Do you think they'll ever get those kids back?
For many Jews, Zionism has meant a movement that led to the safety that offered an escape route and safety for our grandparents' generation. That's true in my own family story. Now, it's also true that Zionism has always meant mass displacement and oppression and injustice for the Palestinian people. For young American Jews, they're asking these questions in the same prism that they're asking other questions about, you know, racial injustice in America. That what young people are seeing on our phones right now, these live stream horrors.
24 شهيد, 24 people were killed here. 22 شهيد من النساء والأطفال. 22 of them are women and children.
The bombings, the starvation, the utter horrors being committed against children. And we're seeing it on our phone live streamed to us by young people who, you know, look like us, who have the same aspirations as we do. And we want the same rights and justice and freedom for these people. And the basic ability to live freely and safely that we have. And I think seeing that alongside seeing these videos of Israeli soldiers celebrating their war crimes and laughing and desecrating the homes that Palestinians have fled in this moment in which they are responsible for the largest displacement of Palestinians since the Nakba, that is prompting a really dramatic reckoning among not just a younger generation, but I think young people are experiencing it in a particular way because we see it in such unfiltered means.
A lot of Israel's supporters in the U.S., when we've seen it, they've done it in the media, they've taken to labeling anti-Zionism as pure anti-Semitism. What do you make of that argument, that conflation? Is there a crossover there? How do you see it?
Look, anti-Semitism can show up anywhere along the political spectrum, just like racism and sexism. I think the real question is, you know, what are the animating values of a movement? And a misrepresentation that we keep seeing consistently is the tarnishing of the movement for Palestinian freedom.
They see something on TikTok and they're like, Israel bad and Hamas good. And they go out and they start shouting at Jews.
It's a movement whose core motives and goals are to stop this mass killing in Gaza, to protect Palestinian life, to demand justice and freedom for the Palestinian people. And we see time and again the misrepresentation of that movement with these false charges of anti-Semitism in ways that, first of all, are such an unfair and grave attack on this movement. And in addition, they create deep confusion about what anti-Semitism is, and it actually makes it harder to identify anti-Semitism and be able to root it out.
You also do important work combating anti-Semitism, and anti-Jewish hate has been on the rise since October 7th. Is the media discussion around that topic, anti-Semitism, doing anything to help people understand what it really is and to fight it?
Yeah, well, I think that's why it's so important to actually talk about this conflation of Jews and Israel and to do our best to separate the two. You know, the so-called leading organization that is often the leading source cited in media around this is the Anti-Defamation League. But the ADL actually has a long history of being opposed to justice movements, most significantly the movement for Palestinian freedom. And in the latest statistics that they've released, and this is not a new phenomenon post-October 7th, but they've certainly escalated in this campaign, they include in their list of anti-Semitic incidents protests led by Jewish organizations and Jewish individuals. So how can we get a true picture of the state of anti-Semitism in this country when the leading organization responsible for telling us about it does not have reliable data? I think that's deeply dangerous for Jewish people. And I also think it's important to say that, you know, we are seeing increased numbers of Jews in the movement for a ceasefire, for Palestinian freedom. And I believe that those thousands of Jews who are out in the streets, not just in the US, but around the world, are helping fight anti-Semitism, because we are breaking that conflation between Jews and Israel's devastating assault on the Gaza Strip. There's documented evidence that whenever there is escalated violence in Israel-Palestine, Jews around the world who have nothing to do with that violence often are unfairly on the receiving end of that blowback from individuals who target Jews out of their rage at Israel.
Last one for you. As a result of the activism, the exposure you got from that documentary, you've become something of a leader within the Jewish community. How hopeful are you that this movement that you're part of, American Jews Against Israel's Occupation, that something meaningful can be achieved in the coming years? Are we at an inflection point?
You know, whenever I get asked this question about hope, it feels important to say, first of all, that it's hard to answer that question in a moment in which Israel has reduced the majority of the Gaza Strip to rubble, in which we are living through the largest attack on Palestinian life and displacement and destruction since the Nakba of 1948. I feel deeply afraid for Palestinians right now, and also for Israeli Jews who are deeply endangered living in this ongoing situation. In addition to that, in this moment of such profound darkness and tragedy, it is incredibly powerful to see so many young people waking up, asking questions, young and old people, joining these movements for justice and freedom for all people. If I just think about college campuses, you know, I got to participate in Shabbat and Passover at the Gaza Solidarity encampment at Columbia University. And it was really moving to me to see all of these young Jews there in the encampment, grappling with the histories that they've been taught, having hard conversations with their friends, with their community members. That to me is hopeful. These movements for justice and for accountability are hopeful, because without that, the red lines that we are seeing moved farther and farther away from any semblance of democracy and respect for human life. That is very scary. And so seeing students rising up and demanding that is a path to an alternative.
Simone Zimmerman, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you.
The turning tide of young Americans, like Simone Zimmerman, away from support for Israel and Zionist ideology could prove to be one of the major developments in the history of Israel's occupation of Palestine. But it is only the latest act in this century-long story, one that cannot be understood without at least a basic understanding of Zionism. News outlets have a big part to play in that. We need to talk about Zionism, explain how it relates to Israel's past, its present, and its ongoing ethnic cleansing of Gaza, its war crimes against Palestinians. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.